Now, arising from the last tape, last recording, which attended to some of the issues and some sort of explanation of the book that I'm in the process of preparing. And that book is called by me at the moment, The Truth of Freedom. Now, by truth of freedom, what I'm looking at is not the issue of being free so as to pursue truth. Rather, I'm looking at what is it about our condition or our state of freedom that makes it free. That's the question. What is it about our freedom that makes it free? In connection with that larger question, I highlighted the fact that another way of putting that is, are we capable of producing new? So freedom may be connected with the producing of something that's new. Another really good way of putting that is to be able to act and express in such a way that what we give rise to is without precedence. Now, when we think along those lines, we come back to this question of knowledge and the degree to which we can generate new significant content of consciousness, let's put it. The classical Platonic analysis has it that the articulation of the universe is achieved through eternal ideas, some sort of ideal constituent of the real universe which is expressed in the articulated world that we experience. Now, I'd like to have a bit of a look at this as we go forward now, because the implication in Plato's position is that we are unable to advance to a newness which for me would be a hallmark of freedom. In Plato's case, Plato has it that we do something which is a little bit like remembering. That through a process of remembering / dreaming / wondering, what arises within our consciousness is eventually awareness of that which was there all along. The only thing that's sort of new is novelty in our experience, but all we're talking about is that passage out of ignorance. However we experience it, we haven't discovered, or we haven't given rise to anything that's new. We've only found awareness that was in us and available, and a constituent of reality always there, ever present, but suddenly we acquired an awareness. Plato, pardon me, Plato's allegory of the cave, and that our consciousness is as though we are in a cave looking at the back wall, and the light is actually behind us, throwing shadows up on that wall. The content of our consciousness is like the shadows thrown out and onto the back wall of the cave by the larger reality, as I said, articulated by these ideas. Now, to take this analysis a little bit further forward, say Aristotle, for example, would talk about reality as being composed of both matter and matter formed, form and matter, and that thought, as it were, is the form of form for Aristotle. Both Plato and Aristotle worked on the assumption that the content of our consciousness, other than mess, is some sort of possession of the same form as the form within a reality beyond us that articulates that reality beyond us. It's a little bit like this. For all who know arithmetic, they all know that 2 and 3 adds up to 5. Now, this idea, 2 and 3 equals 5, is the same idea in every head that thinks it. One idea and an endless succession of heads, all of whom entertain in their thoughts the same idea. Plato's forms or ideas are like, if you like, the 2 plus 3 equals 5. One idea living in many versions. When I say with my voice 2 plus 3 equals 5, probably those who know me would distinguish me from some other speaker uttering the same idea. The vehicle that expresses the idea, the medium that expresses the idea, may vary, but the idea is constant. On that same reasoning, there are many versions of dogs, but there is only, in essence, one idea of a dog. Now, that one idea is instantiated in a vast multiplicity of creatures. For Plato, if one pins down the complete and sufficient definition of a dog, one will capture the idea that is necessarily present for a dog to be a dog. Now, this reasoning prevailed for 2,000 years. And I spoke last time about how Augustine noticing the movement of divine grace brought revelation about in the human mind, through which awareness of the ideas which, by constituting reality, are obviously the truth of reality. So truths, with Augustine, were revealed to us through divine grace, and through which, by possession of which, we grasp reality. Now, as I say, that this prevailed for 2,000 years. Now, a truly remarkable development in human history occurred as the 18th century became well established. Signs appeared around 1720 and gained greater momentum by the sort of over the next 30 years, let's say. This is a period known as the Enlightenment, known now. And in some ways, even those participants there and then understood themselves as looking to enlighten humanity. Now, during the Enlightenment, a truly remarkable thing occurred, in that, through the labours of only a few people, what was achieved was the defeat, irrevocably and demonstrably, of the Platonic ideal, reinforced with Aristotle, fashioned together and raised to a religious peak by Augustine, and consequently served as a means for securing the stability and dominance, if you like, of a system of social management that prevailed, particularly as it grew to its culmination, prevailed for 1,000 years. In this defeat, and to make it clear, while the defeat was secure in the minds of honest thinkers, this achievement has still not found its place in the popular mind of 6 or 7 billion people on the planet who are still at the mercy of people whose underlying insights are not yet of those achieved by the Enlightenment. Because the problem of what is it about freedom that makes us free was solved, but because of its social consequences, it was well and truly contained. The greatest figure, and the one who delivered such an amazing and overwhelming, irrefutable proof of it, was the great Denis Diderot. And perhaps just to show a picture of Diderot, Here he is, a very famous portrait. This was a portrait made in about the 1760s. This portrait has some characteristics which in its time would have been quite spectacular. The most prominent one is that he's not wearing a wig. You see, if you look at pictures of Rousseau, who was very, very close friend and confidant of Diderot's for many years, pictures of even David Hume, Johann Sebastian Bach, Handel, the kings and the queen, all the great nobles, Leibniz, they all wore wigs, but not Diderot. Of all the great names, the Montesquieus and the Voltaires and the Fontenelles, these great names of the Enlightenment, they were all of aristocratic, small-time aristocratic families. Some, Baron Montesquieu were a little bit more robust in their aristocratic prestige and privilege. Diderot was the only one who was formally and rigorously educated. And of all the great names, Diderot is the only one who was noticed as an exceedingly brilliant boy and was prepared by the Jesuits, who not only educated him to entry to the Sorbonne, but by his own efforts, Diderot had a very handsome master's degree from the Sorbonne, unlike the rest. Rigorous and formally trained in philosophy. Now, one of the things that the Enlightenment, the Enlighteners, were very much preoccupied was the grip, if you like, of the church in France at that time. They were certainly great beneficiaries of the established still a feudal system, if you like. There was a unbelievable plundering still of the peasant folk and then the townspeople. And there was a tremendous economic privilege available to the aristocrats. Within that context, the great figures of the church were likewise involved. This is not to deny that humble priests cared for the humble folk out in the smaller villages. But in any case, the Enlighteners were preoccupied with the liberation of the general human mind from the yoke placed upon it, first and foremost, by a fairly rigid discipline and constraint of thought, administered, let's call it, by the church. Consequently, that was their target. Voltaire, for example, would say quite clearly he's not an opponent of religion per se, but he's an opponent of the religious institutions and what they did for the living human mind across French society. comes back to this problem of freedom and the human mind. And the human mind, if it knew something, the knowledge was sort of secured essentially by a revelation, and all that was revealed to you what was there all along. This is still, in many ways, still taught in the textbooks for undergraduate philosophy nowadays. In looking to extend the strategy of the liberation of the human mind, Voltaire was conspicuous in his bitter, biting and exceptionally witty attack on the church, the way he sort of raised it to ridicule, etc. But Diderot did something different and profoundly different. What they sought to do was to develop a compendium of all human knowledge. The great project of the encyclopedia. And by bringing this great compendium together, people would, in many ways, become freer. At that time, the notion of freedom that was guiding them was one derived essentially from Spinoza. Spinoza looked at the question of freedom essentially like this. He saw that ignorance was something that deeply restricted our capacity to act. The Spinozistic view of the problem of attaining freedom is as though we understood ourselves as lost in a jungle, lost somewhere we know not where, in a wilderness. Consequently, we don't know whether going to the left or to the right is the way that we should proceed forward. Spinoza's notion of becoming free is through, as it were, the provision for us of a map of where we were in reality. A map that enabled us to successfully choose paths, and a map and a manual of reality that enabled us to act not only more successfully, but act with greater options. If we knew where we were and how to do things, we would be freer in the reality of our experience on earth. This is the notion of freedom. That's the foundation of what subsequently grew into European liberalism. Now, to come back to Denis Diderot, master of the Sorbonne. Through the encyclopedia, the essence of the project was to so draw together the information that some knew here, some knew over there, some knew in England, and while people in France did not know it, to draw all that information together and unify it in a set of books that were so laid out that one could find one's way through the books and then find one's way to the knowledge. One would have a user's manual and a map of reality which would liberate the activities of the living human being in the world. That started off as the great project. And it had some detractors, but they were very quickly. Diderot was originally in alliance with Rousseau. The great D'Alembert was the principal mathematician of Europe. The French intelligentsia drew around this something that to them was manifestly truly noble and truly realisable. A great project of pooling in an accessible way all this great knowledge so that human life would become freer. Now, just to tell the story, the great Prospectus, which is a book in its own right, basically authored by Diderot and D'Alembert, hit the deck in 1851. Things really got underway. Very large number of subscribers put money down, so the funding came into place. There was a publisher who was ready to start pulling all the works together. Articles from left, right and centre, all conceivable topics were allocated. Volunteers came forward, professors here and scientists there. These things all came forward and the great project got underway. And at first it was pretty good. In about 1856-57 there was a major falling out between Diderot and Rousseau. In retrospect we can see Rousseau had started to acquire what now we would recognise as real psychiatric conditions. He started to have delusions of paranoid delusions, one could say. He saw enemies where only friends stood in front of him, and so things gradually got out of hand. By 1859 the authorities had become clear as to what the wider ramifications would be. 1759, the authorities had become clear that if this project would succeed, a sort of a change, a fantastic cultural change, whereby individuals will become freer, more competent, fuller of demands for their place in society. And it became obvious where things were going to go. And so in 1759, a decision was made to close down the encyclopedia. It was driven underground. And many people abandoned the project. Diderot essentially pressed on by himself. We are talking of an effort, a sustained effort of longer hours than probably any seriously responsible business executive does, day and night, basically without let up, for 20 years. Now, what took Diderot, and we're talking about a work when it was finally published. There's more than 30 volumes, and each of the volumes are bigger than the encyclopedia. These are as big as books are made, and there were more than 30 of them. It is a phenomenal achievement just to do what was done, except that nothing remotely like it had ever occurred. Now, just to give the setting of what was achieved, what went on in parallel, because the scientific community was sort of aware, and particularly there was a current of talk. In those days there was extensive letter writing and things came out with letters. This was the heyday of the development of science. What happened in the scientific community was that in the 1750s, the chemists had discovered that not all of the air was capable of sustaining life. It's not a... Nowadays, we know that about 20% of the air is oxygen and about 80% is nitrogen. If you breathe pure nitrogen, you'll suffocate very quickly. If you breathe pure oxygen, you will become so hyperactive. And now, because they had put living things into sealed enclosures, and they discovered that when oxygen was effectively consumed, as we now know it, that there was a sort of consumption of some part of the air, and then things died. This advanced so that in the 1770s, late 1760s, Lavoisier eventually brought forward the theory of oxygen and nitrogen, that air is a mixture of gases. Now, the point to be noticed here is that prior to this recognition, throughout the whole history of human beings, air was deemed to be a fundamental element, what makes up reality, foundational elements: earth, wind, i.e. air, fire and water. These were deemed absolutely foundational. One could understand the alchemists as looking, because they accepted this fundamental principle of, these four constituents of all reality, that the purpose or the strategy of the alchemists working with those assumptions was to continuously search for the appropriate combinations of temperature, and there may be a succession of combinations, but to find the recipe whereby, for example, lead could be transformed to gold, or that anything that was to find out how it was constituted. So, the moment that it really hit the deck, that since the absolute dawn of human consciousness to the 1760s or 1770s, that we had believed that air was just one fundamental element, the concept of air, the one which was found to be inadequate, we could see that experience now required us to change our concept. We could ask, what's the difference in the content of our mind, the difference in our ideas before Lavoisier and after Lavoisier? It became obvious that two things were going on. One was the immanent defining form or idea of reality out there, and the other one was the concepts we formed here, or we had here, and these concepts did not coincide with what existed externally. That suddenly science could be seen as a process somehow or another of, as it were, giving rise to concepts and testing them through examination, experimentation, and whatever. Suddenly we saw a world of things in our heads which seemed not to derive from processes recognised by Plato and Aristotle, and also we certainly couldn't pin it onto a divinity because we had crook ideas. Somewhere along the line, the ideas came about in a different way. Now, that's in the background. This is a sort of a new consideration, active amongst the scientists and brought to clear fruition and self-conscious, by say a reflective self-conscious awareness, by the great Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason of 1781, where he clearly sees the role of the human subject in the genesis of consciousness. In any case, now let's come back to Diderot. Diderot not only was a brilliant student, a protege of the Jesuits until he turned his back on them, and master of the Sorbonne, but he came from quite remarkable personal circumstances. Unlike the rest of the philosophes who were the major protagonists of the Enlightenment, Diderot was the son of a cutler. Now, by cutler, back in those days, is somebody, a master maker of fine metal work like swords, rapiers, swords used for military purposes, indeed very fine metalworking of all sorts. That's what a cutler was. Today's equivalent is a tool maker. The son of a tool maker, the principal craftsman in the great hierarchy, the craftsman, crucial to all other crafts by virtue of making tools and making equipment, and also held in highest respect by the rest of the crafts because of the skill required to fulfill his job, and the arduousness, the great demand made on concentration and intelligence to perform his work. This connection Diderot exploited, because in connection with the encyclopedia he went around in this mighty labour, and we are talking day and night after night, every night for 10 years. And one crafts master after another made the introductions around Paris, around the workshops, around the factories as they were in the 1760s. What Diderot was shown were the ways in which everything was manufactured in industry. For example, here we've got plate on the blast furnace. You see, Diderot not only worked or spoke to the craftsmen and the men who worked the thing, but he got a rigorous understanding. There's more on the blast furnace. And more again. And more again. And more again. And more. And more. And on it went. The specific tools and their design. Specific methodologies. The articulation of processes. The design. "11 massive volumes. There were engravers, 30, 40 engravers, preparing these diagrams. Look at this. Just on and on. You just have to keep seeing this. Cannons, cannon making. How they cast the cannons. How they machine them. The diagrams, the designs done. How the casting was done. One can it's just page after page after page. If one looks even more closely here, you can see how little letters were written over the diagrams, over the pictures, so that accompanying text explained how the processes functioned. Now these books, to just go through and just show you process after process, explanation after explanation, from people knowing nothing. It's as though they were shown that much of how a car was made, how you make the machines to make the cars, how the whole principles of the engines, principles of suspension, principles of steering, Diderot made the stuff in such a way This one is metalworking, but it showed you how to make glass, mines, cutaway diagrams of larger structures. It was probably a brewery or something like that. But you name it, if industry going back over generations and generations of workmen succeeding each other who had good ideas there, good ideas here, solutions to problems and improvements on solution to problems, as well as innovations as to new ways of doing things. And so it just goes on and on and on. Here's, it looks like kilns making bricks. On and on and on. How fishing, the whole system by which fishing was undertaken, construction of windmills. These are two books here that have been published. It's just a selection of diagrams from the encyclopedia. At this size, this was the size of one of them, and 11 volumes of plates were prepared. Nowadays, if you ever see any line drawing which look quite exquisite, line drawings from the 18th century, they are all derived from the diagrams of the great encyclopedia. But just not processes. Here's one. Architectural plates from the encyclopedia. Not only you get intricate drawings, exquisitely done, plan layouts of buildings and how they were done. If you wanted to be an architect, your task, first and foremost, was to get yourself a copy of the get access to the encyclopedia. Frame and truss designs. It's just a miracle of human intelligence to have pulled things like this together to show the accumulated practical know-how by means of which not nature but the human world was built, how it was supplied, how it worked, in one monumental effort. All the knowledge of all the trades were brought together and revealed. On and on it goes. 11 massive volumes. Now, I can't start. It's very hard to overstate the impact that something like this would make. You see, in the real world of France, all the little knowledges, the know-how by which the master brewers made their beer was kept secret by the master brewers in the Guild of Brewers. And the guild, who knew how to, make bread, kept the ways of bread making to themselves. To defend their livelihoods, guilds had been formed around specific trades and specific industrial functions, and they kept their secrets to themselves. In one move, Diderot burst open the phenomenal restrictions on the knowledge of human know-how. He burst it apart. He absolutely finished the guild system. Most importantly, he absolutely liberated the human mind from the point of view of undertaking absolutely new engineering innovations. If you were an engineer, all you'd need to do, because up until that time, if you knew about mines, you did not know too much about architectural construction, probably very little about glass making. You did not know broader and more general principles. Now, in the 1760s, where Diderot was still under wraps and people played it very safe, there was nevertheless in Paris regular meetings of the philosophes. David Hume was, because he was very fluent in French, he came and was in Paris for a number of years as the personal secretary to the English ambassador to France. I forget his name, but an aristocrat and patron of Hume. Hume, because of his publications, was already acknowledged and recognised by the philosophes as a brilliant member of their company, an Englishman who spoke French and who thought along the lines that they did. Now, Hume's dear and good friend was none other than the great Adam Smith, who sits in one of the largest chairs in the great pantheon of economists and political economy in our own English tradition. And I have not yet seen documentary proof, but what appears to be the case is that this, under the inspiration of the great encyclopedia Information, because it used to come out a volume or two a year. They did the A's and you had the A volume at home, and then the B and C volume would arrive. But it is only in the 1760s that suddenly the plates started to be put together and published with their explanations in conjunction with the larger written texts. In the late 1760s, and it was described that the people initiating were a group of gentlemen in Edinburgh or Glasgow, I forget which one, but in Scotland, the Encyclopedia Britannica was launched under the inspiration of the Encyclopedia of Diderot in Paris, the Enlightenment thing. Furthermore, copies of the encyclopedia with their plates, I believe it certainly, would have gone to the university in Edinburgh, I think Edinburgh, where Hume he worked in the library there. He could never be given an academic appointment because he was a professed agnostic, and in deeply pious and religious Scotland you could not get a position teaching in the universities if you told people up front you couldn't accept that the proposition of a divinity and a providential involvement in the world. His great friend was the great Professor Adam Smith, Professor of Philosophy in Edinburgh. Smith was a physiocrat, as the economists who were active and who wrote physiocratic articles, particularly Quesnay, in the encyclopedia. Smith, the moment that you really start thinking about the diagrams that explain the processes and you see human beings active in those processes, you would recognise as a physiocrat two key things which characterise the great book The Wealth of Nations by Smith. And that is the labour theory of value. Physiocrats had it that all wealth ultimately derived from nature itself and the growth process of nature. When you look at those diagrams, you recognise the truth that human agency adds value to nature. It transforms it and renders it more valuable for human needs and human purposes. It's as obvious as anything. Sorry? Already? Has the thing run out? Oh, that's okay. I think the story's okay, so I'll go on just a little bit more. And you would see the division of labour, the great diagrams, the 11 mighty volumes showed the division of labour and how through that division, specialisation, the deepening of knowledge and know-how in each of these different arms of industry, so things approached greater levels of perfection, if you like. So Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, is in essence the physiocratic theory of the origin of wealth, coupled with the great insight of the value add that humanity makes to nature and the capacity for improvement and development to occur through the division of labour. Now, another absolutely profound consideration comes out, and this is what the great Diderot actually understood, although I would think my way of putting it is perhaps clearer today because we've had the benefit of many coming after Diderot. What Diderot realised, and this is what comes, it's in Immanuel Kant, he realised that human consciousness, the content of human consciousness, is actually made by human beings. We don't make it arbitrarily. But if we wish to write novels, we author those novels. We certainly don't wait for divine inspiration to do so, or it doesn't appear to be so. It's maybe stretching a long bow to say that. Diderot recognised the reality of human agency in the production of human ideas. The Platonic and Aristotelian and Augustan theory were misleading, irrelevant, and downright wrong in telling us how all those things came into being that were depicted in the great 11 volumes that showed the human know-how, how you made beer. There's no Platonic ideas that talk about how you make beer, how you make glass, how wood is worked and combined together, not without nails, to make tongue-in groove joins on floorboards, to cut them out, to cut wedges and that in corners so things could be put together, how to melt tar, etc., and put it on boats to make boats waterproof, how sewing could be done, how indeed even clothes should be cut, how agriculture could occur, the tools by which harvests can be made efficient, the making of pottery. All of these were innovations, inventions, if you like, but an expression of the power that lies within human being. And indeed, in these expressions and in these actions, we saw what emerged out of free action of human beings. The quintessence of human being is in the industry, the agriculture, in the mastery of great skills, the surgical instruments, the beauty of the diagrams, and the even the ingenuity in the instruments that the medical community had established so as to perform their medical duties. All of these showed that what we are able to do is conceive of possibilities and to criticise them, both through the logical, rational movement, reasoning, weighing up things in our own minds, in talking with each other so as to weigh things up, and indeed putting ideas into practice and challenging the ideas themselves to reveal even more of their potential or to show us if they are eventually false. This is a process of science, but something more. This rational development of know-how, which is now loosely and idly called technology, but it is a power that lies within humanity, and it seems groundless to say that this is delivered on a sort of moment-to-moment, day-to-day basis through divine providence, as it were, delivering illumination to our mind. And it's certainly not Platonic ideas, as it were, popping into our heads through processes of remembrance or something like that. No, it's hard, slogging work that shows us something about the character of, as it were, the human spirit. Of that force, the realisation of the possibilities of the spirit. The action of the spirit is our freedom. What our free human action actually is the expression in action of our awareness of possibility. That's actually how we're constituted. The expression in action, in words, in movement, in purposive advance, the expression in an action of our awareness of possibility. And that awareness of possibility is not something that comes into our minds through the light shining there and the images we get of the thing around. This comes out of ourselves. It's that intrinsic characteristic of the human spirit that is our freedom. As a consequence, the duty we have to all the young folk is to liberate and expand their capacity to be aware of possibility and to form possibility, express it and act in accordance with their awareness of it. That's the truth of freedom.